A true account of 6 people who ventured into Denali National Park during the summer of 2019. 4 of us returned. This is the record of what happened to the others and what they became. The thing that bothered me most, in those first few hours after everything changed, was that no one had questioned Michael Williams about the trip details. Michael was the kind of man who controlled every variable, who needed to know precisely what he was purchasing and when. He had the kind of mind that caught discrepancies the way a net catches fish. Yet when he proposed this hunting expedition to all of us, when he laid out the maps and discussed the permits and mentioned the remote cabin deep in the park near the Teclanica River, none of us thought to ask him how exactly he had obtained access to that particular location. I was 38 years old at the time. My name is not important for this narrative. What matters is that I was part of the group, and I carried a rifle, and I walked into one of the most pristine and brutal wilderness areas in North America, believing I understood what danger looked like. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about most things. Michael had been my associate at the investment firm for 6 years. He was pragmatic, skeptical, the kind of man who dismissed ghost stories with a wave of his hand. He had been divorced twice. He spent his summers hunting elk in various remote locations, always chasing the perfect animal, never satisfied with what he had taken. Robert Wilson, who worked in equipment supply, had been his hunting partner for over a decade. They had climbed mountains together in British Columbia. They had tracked musk oxen in the Arctic. There was a rhythm to their friendship that predated my understanding of it. When Michael proposed this trip in May, the invitation came with specificity. He wanted 6 people total. He wanted 2 weeks. He wanted to hunt in areas that most outfitters did not access, places that required serious navigation skills and genuine wilderness experience. He mentioned Denali almost as an afterthought, as though the location itself was secondary to the challenge of the hunt. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, he said. It was available. It was equipped for extended stays. There was a radio, though the signal was unreliable. There was a generator. There were enough supplies stockpiled to sustain a small group for 3 weeks if necessary. Jessica Garcia accepted the invitation within 2 days. She was an accomplished hunter, a former military officer, someone who had traveled to Africa for safari expeditions. She brought a precision rifle and an absolute confidence in her abilities. Robert agreed immediately. Then came William Rodriguez, a retired contractor who had built half the lodges in Alaska and knew the terrain like a man knows his own house. Amanda Clark, a physician from Anchorage, accepted after requesting a week off from her practice. There was the 6 of us, though I did not know Amanda well, and I had only met Jessica twice before the expedition began. We flew into Denali in the 2nd week of June. The sun barely set that time of year. At 11 in the evening, the sky was still a pale blue-gray, the kind of light that made you feel like you were being watched from above. Michael had arranged everything through local contacts. A bush pilot flew us to an airstrip 40 miles from the cabin. We hiked in during daylight that lasted nearly the entire 24 hours. That first stretch of walking, carrying our equipment through terrain that rose and fell like the breathing of some immense creature, was when I began to feel the wrongness in that place, not in the way a tourist might feel it, with vague unease and the poetry of isolation. I felt it in my bones. I felt it as a pulling in my chest, the way an animal feels an earthquake before the ground shakes. None of the others mentioned feeling it. They were focused on the task. Michael checked his GPS regularly. Robert pointed out animal sign. Jessica adjusted her pack straps. William told stories about hunting trips past, his voice steady and confident. Amanda took photographs of the landscape, documenting the lupine flowers and distant peaks. We reached the cabin on the evening of the 2nd day. It sat in a clearing near a stand of white-barked willows that grew thick along the river. The structure was larger than I expected, built in the style of a remote hunting lodge with multiple rooms and what appeared to be genuine care put into its maintenance. The generator hummed. The supplies were there. The radio sat on a shelf in the main room, beside a logbook that had entries dating back 3 years. Various hunters and adventurers had stayed here. Various people had recorded their observations. Michael opened the logbook casually. He did not seem to expect anything remarkable in its pages. It was only after we had eaten our first meal and settled into the cabin, as the endless daylight faded to a thick twilight that lasted until after midnight, that I pulled the logbook from the shelf and began to read it. The entries were routine at first: dates, names, weather observations, successful hunts and unsuccessful ones. By the third year of entries, the tone of the notes had shifted. The handwriting became more compressed, the language more economical. People who had visited the cabin seemed to be rushing through their notations, writing only what was necessary. One entry from 2 years prior, written by a man named Derek Paulson, consisted of a single line: "We heard it in the willows. We left early." Another, from 14 months prior, written in the careful script of someone trying to be precise: "Saw something large move across the ridge at dusk. Did not resemble any known animal. Did not move like any animal I have seen. Movement was wrong. It walked wrong." The final entry was dated 3 weeks before our arrival. A woman named Patricia Hendricks had written, "I watched it approach the cabin at night. I watched it stand on its hind legs outside the window. Its hands were wrong. Its fingers were too long and the joints bent backward. I put the rifle barrel against its chest and it did not move. It simply looked at me. Then it made a sound. Then I shot it. Then I ran. I ran until the pilot found me." There was nothing after that entry. No explanation. No follow-up. Patricia Hendricks, according to her notation at the top of her page, had been attempting a 2-week stay. She had left after 5 days. I did not tell the others what I had read. I told myself it was because I did not want to seed paranoia in a remote location where paranoia could become dangerous. The truth was more complicated. I kept the entries to myself because I was afraid that if I shared them, they would become real in a way they were not, while they remained private words in a book. I was afraid because some part of me, the deep part that remembered when humans cowered in caves and listened to things move through the darkness outside, recognized the tone of those final entries. They were written by someone who had seen something that could not be explained away. We established our routine over the first few days. Michael and Robert would hunt during the morning hours, traveling into the higher elevations where Dall sheep moved through the rocky terrain. Jessica often accompanied them. Amanda set up a small medical station in one of the side rooms, a habit from her professional life that she seemed unable to abandon even in the wilderness. William spent his time checking the structural integrity of the cabin, ensuring the generator would continue to function, monitoring our supplies. I spent my time hiking alone, exploring the valleys and ridges that surrounded our base, navigating through streams that ran with glacial water so cold it numbed my hands in seconds. I told myself I was scouting for elk. I told myself I was enjoying the solitude. The truth was that I was running from something, even though I did not know what. It was during one of these solo hikes, on the 5th day of our expedition, that I found the thing in the clearing. The clearing sat in a depression between 2 ridges, accessible only through a narrow ravine that required scrambling over loose stone and navigating around boulders the size of houses. I had not planned to go there. I had simply followed a game trail that seemed to lead somewhere interesting, and it had carried me downward, deeper into the park, further from our cabin. The thing was lying in the center of the clearing. At first I thought it was a moose calf, something young and broken. The hide was dark brown, nearly black, and it was matted with something that might have been blood or might have been mud. The animal was not moving. It was not breathing. The smell that rose from it was wrong in a way I could not articulate. As I approached, I realized that the limbs were all wrong. The proportions were wrong. The head, when I came close enough to see it clearly, was not the head of any animal that lived in Alaska. The skull was elongated. The teeth, visible through the open jaw, were arranged in a pattern that suggested a mouth that had been torn open from the inside. The eyes, milky and frozen, had a shape that made me think of human eyes more than animal eyes. I did not touch it. I stood there for perhaps 5 minutes, breathing through my mouth, trying to understand what I was looking at. The fur on my arms was standing on end. My heart was beating in a way that made me aware of each individual strike against my ribs. Then I heard the sound from the willows. It was not a sound that had an easy name. It was not a roar or a howl or any vocalization that belonged to the animal kingdom. It was something between a whisper and a shriek, something that contained human properties and animal properties and something else entirely. It came from multiple directions at once, from the willows that grew along the stream that fed this depression, from the shadows under the rocks, from the air itself. I ran. I did not think. I simply turned and ran back the way I had come, scrambling up the ravine, slipping on loose stone, pulling myself up with my hands, not caring if I fell or injured myself. I ran until my lungs burned. I ran until I could not hear the sound anymore. When I returned to the cabin, I told no one where I had been. I did not mention what I had found. The others were preparing for the evening meal. Michael had taken a young ram that morning, a beautiful animal with horns that spiraled perfectly. He was talking about how he would mount it, where in his office he would hang it, what it would mean to look at it every day. I sat at the table and listened to him talk about the dead animal, and I thought about the thing in the clearing, and I thought about Patricia Hendricks shooting something that did not move when she pulled the trigger. That night, I did not sleep. None of us slept well, though we did not discuss it. I lay in my bunk in the room I shared with William, and I listened to the silence of that place. Denali was not silent. There was always the sound of the wind, the distant rush of water, the occasional call of a bird. But beneath those sounds was something else, a presence, a waiting. At some point after midnight, when the twilight outside had reached its deepest gray, I heard something move on the roof of the cabin. It was not an animal. An animal does not move with that kind of deliberation. It was not the wind. The wind does not place one foot down carefully, pause, then place another foot down. It was not the generator. The generator ran with a constant mechanical rhythm. I heard it walk the length of the cabin roof. I heard it pause above our bedroom door. I heard it continue to the far end of the structure and then stop. When I heard it descend the outside wall, I closed my eyes. I tried to control my breathing. I tried not to move. In the darkness, William slept the sleep of the exhausted, unaware that something had just touched the outside wall of the cabin where his head rested, unaware that something had been directly above us in the dark. I remained awake until the sun began to rise again, that pale blue light beginning to seep through the windows, pushing back the darkness. Only when the twilight became full morning did I allow myself to rest, and even then I could not truly sleep. The next morning, Michael called a meeting. He had arranged everything without consulting any of us. We would begin a more serious hunt, he said. He had received information from someone at the ranger station about elk movements in the higher elevations. We would travel as two groups, push deeper into the park, establish a secondary camp, and attempt to close in on a major bull that had been spotted repeatedly by park staff. Robert was energized by this news. Jessica asked detailed questions about the terrain and distance. Amanda seemed concerned about the risks of overextending our supplies, but her objection was mild, and Michael waved it away easily. William looked at me. His expression did not change, but I saw something in his eyes. He had heard it too, the thing on the roof, the sound that belonged to no animal in North America. He was afraid. That was when I understood that whatever was in Denali with us, whatever was moving through the willows and walking across our roof in the darkness, it was not paranoia or imagination. It was real enough that a man who had spent 40 years building things in remote places, a man who had faced grizzlies and storms and the genuine dangers of the wilderness, could look afraid. It was real enough that Patricia Hendricks had shot something that did not react to the impact of a bullet. It was real enough that something had been leaving messages in a logbook for 3 years, written by people who had seen it and lived to record the experience. Michael began organizing the extended hunt the following morning. We would leave after breakfast. The two groups would travel separately. Michael, Robert, and Jessica would head toward the higher elevations to the east, following the reported elk sightings. William, Amanda, and I would travel to the north, toward a ridge system that William believed might shelter a mature bull. Neither group was supposed to venture into the willows. Michael had been specific about that in his briefing. The willows were a maze. A person could become lost in them easily. The visibility was poor. The ground was unstable. Stay in the open terrain. Stay where you can see. Stay clear of the dense vegetation. I did not mention that I had found something in a clearing surrounded by willows, that the thing I had found suggested that the willows were not just an inconvenience but a boundary, a place where something else held dominion. We left as planned. William carried the primary rifle. Amanda carried a smaller caliber weapon that she was competent with. I carried a large pack with supplies for the extended camp and a radio that I hoped would maintain better signal in the northern terrain. The first day of travel was uneventful. We moved methodically, covering the ground at a steady pace, speaking only when necessary. The landscape was magnificent. Tundra stretched in all directions, broken only by rocky outcrops and stands of stunted spruce. The sky was enormous. The sense of exposure was both liberating and terrifying. We established our secondary camp that evening in a depression between two ridges, on ground that was relatively flat and relatively clear of vegetation. We had traveled 12 miles from the main cabin. The radio crackled with sporadic contact from Michael and Robert, confirming their position, reporting good weather, discussing the animal signs they had found. That night we took turns standing watch. We had brought rifles, and we had brought bear spray, and we had brought all the equipment that humans carry into wilderness when they believed they might need to defend themselves against animal predators. None of it would have made a difference. During the second watch, which I took between midnight and 2 in the morning, I heard the sound again. It came from the willow stand about a half-mile to the south, the direction from which we had come. It was the same sound I had heard in the clearing, that hybrid shriek that contained human properties alongside something alien. I did not fire a warning shot. I did not shout to wake the others. I simply stood there in the endless twilight, and I listened to the sound, and I understood that we were not hunters anymore. We were something else. We were bait. We were prey. When Amanda came to relieve me at 2 in the morning, she saw my face and asked if something was wrong. I told her I was simply tired. She did not believe me, but she did not press the question. The next day, William decided to change our plans. He said the terrain to the north was not as promising as he had initially thought. He wanted to move east, toward the ridgeline, toward terrain that might offer better hunting opportunities, toward the willows, toward the direction where the sound had come from. I understood what was happening. William was not changing our course because of the terrain or the hunting. He was changing our course because he wanted to find it. He wanted to see it. He wanted to understand what it was that was moving through Denali, what it was that had been leaving messages in the logbook, what it was that had walked on our roof in the darkness. I did not stop him. I did not suggest an alternative route. I followed along, and Amanda followed along, and we began to move toward the willows. The transition was gradual. The sparse tundra with its stunted vegetation began to give way to slightly denser growth. The willows became more frequent, clustering in shallow valleys where water could accumulate. The terrain became more broken, less open, more difficult to navigate. William seemed to know exactly where he was going. He did not consult his map or his GPS. He simply moved forward with a certainty that suggested he had either been here before or he was being guided by something I could not sense. Amanda kept pace with me, about 50 meters behind William, both of us watching the landscape, both of us listening for the sound we had heard in the camp during my watch. It did not come. The day was quiet except for the wind and the occasional call of a ptarmigan. But the quality of the silence was different. It was the silence of something that knew we were here, that was aware of our movement, that was playing by rules we did not understand. On the afternoon of the third day, we came upon the first evidence that we were not the only humans in this part of the park. It was a boot, a single hiking boot, sitting upright on a rock outcrop, as though someone had carefully placed it there. The material was weathered and stained, but the construction was recent, probably no more than 2 years old. There was no skeleton inside it, no bones, no remains. Simply the boot, placed in a way that was deliberate. William stopped and looked at it for a long time. He did not touch it. He simply stood there, his rifle hanging loose at his side, looking at this object that suggested absence, that suggested someone who had walked out of their boot and never returned to retrieve it. "We should move on," Amanda said. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the tension underneath it. William picked up the boot. He turned it over in his hands. There was a name written inside in faded ink. Gerald Morris. "This is from the 2015 expedition," William said. "A climbing group that came through the park. One of them vanished. They found his tent empty. They found his other boot. They never found him." "How do you know that?" I asked. William did not answer. He simply dropped the boot back onto the rock and continued walking east, toward the willows. We saw no other evidence of Gerald Morris. No other belongings. No remains. Simply the suggestion that he had walked in one direction and walked out of another form, that he had ceased to exist in the way that humans exist and become something else. As we moved deeper into the territory of the willows, the landscape began to change in ways that were subtle but cumulative. The vegetation grew denser. The visibility shortened. We could no longer see the ridges and valleys that surrounded us. We could only see a small circle of terrain immediately ahead, the rest obscured by the growth of trees and shrubs. I began to notice other details. Small piles of stones arranged in patterns that were clearly not natural. Marks on tree trunks that were too regular to be wildlife signs. A cleared area where a fire had been built at some point, though there was no way to determine when. These were human signs. These were evidence of human activity, recent enough to suggest ongoing presence, old enough that no one had claimed them or occupied them in a deliberate way. "Someone is living out here," Amanda said. "Not someone," William replied. "Something." He continued forward without offering explanation. I followed. Amanda followed. The three of us moved through the willows as though we were walking through the chambers of some vast organism, moving deeper into its interior, moving further from the light. It was during late afternoon, when the sky had taken on the particular quality of Alaskan summer light, neither day nor night, but something between, that we encountered the first concrete evidence that we had entered a territory that belonged to something other than the Park Service or the animals that the Park Service protected. The structure was partially concealed by willows, built into the side of a small ridge so that it was half embedded in the earth. It appeared to have been constructed from bone, large bones, the structural supports clearly visible, lashed together with sinew that had long since petrified. The exterior was covered with a material that might have been skin, though the tanning process that had preserved it had rendered it an indeterminate gray-brown color. A small opening served as a doorway. There was nothing inside except darkness. We did not enter. We stood at a distance of about 20 meters and looked at the structure, and I felt Amanda's hand close on my arm. "This is not possible," she said. "This is not an actual thing." "It has always been here," William said. His voice was strange, distant, as though he was speaking from very far away or from very long ago, long before the park, long before the state, long before the country. "It has always been here." "How do you know?" I asked. William turned to me. His eyes were different. The irises seemed to have expanded, to take up more of the space in his skull. The whites of his eyes were threaded with fine red lines, as though he had not slept in days. "Because I remember," he said. He turned back to the structure made of bone and skin. He began to walk toward it. "William, stop," I said. He did not stop. He moved toward the entrance with a gait that was no longer quite his own. The way his legs moved, the way his arms swung, the angle of his head, it had all subtly shifted. He was still William Rodriguez, still the man who had built lodges throughout Alaska, still the man who had spoken about moose hunting and the pleasure of a good bourbon, but he was also something else now. He reached the entrance of the bone structure and looked inside. Then he made a sound. It was not screaming. It was not any sound that human vocal cords were designed to produce. It was the same sound we had heard in the clearing by the willows, the sound that seemed to come from multiple layers of reality at once, that contained human components and animal components, and something else that I had no name for. Amanda pulled her rifle up. "William, move away from that structure." He did not move. He stood at the entrance, looking into the darkness, making that sound. Then, from the darkness, something answered him. It emerged slowly. The head came first, and I have spent 2 years trying to describe that head to myself in a way that makes it real. But the truth is that I fail every time. It was the head of a canine predator, an enormous canine, built on a scale that suggested an animal weighing somewhere between 600 and 1,000 pounds. But the head was wrong. The proportions were human. The skull was too large, but the facial structure, beneath the distortion of predator genetics, held an unmistakable human architecture. The body that emerged from the structure was no more comprehensible. It was immense, covered in thick fur, moving with a predator's grace and a man's deliberation. The front limbs were less animal than the head suggested, more muscular and more directed in their motion. The hind legs supported the body weight in a way that suggested this creature could walk upright, could stand on those legs as a man stands, could look down at a human as an adult looks down at a child. But it was the hands that froze my blood. The creature had hands at the end of its front limbs, not paws, actual hands with fingers and joints, though the proportions were wrong in the way that Patricia Hendricks had described in the logbook. The fingers were too long, the joints bent backward. They were hands that had been built for a body too large, scaled up past the point of natural proportion. William was still making that sound. The creature was moving closer to him. "Fire," I said to Amanda. "That is William," she said. "Fire." She hesitated for a second. Then she raised the rifle and fired at the creature. The shot was good, placed center mass, the kind of shot that would stop a grizzly bear. The creature flinched. Blood bloomed from the wound, dark and thick. But it did not stop. It continued forward. Amanda fired again. The creature flinched again. But it did not fall. It did not even slow its approach. It simply continued forward until it reached William, and then it placed one of those terrible hands on his shoulder. William's sound stopped. He turned to look at the creature with an expression of such profound peace, such complete surrender, that I understood I was watching him cease to be what he had been. "Run," he said to us. "It is not interested in me yet. It wants you to run." We ran. We ran back through the willows, back the way we had come, both of us moving as fast as the terrain would allow, slipping on loose stone, crashing through vegetation, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind us, we could hear the sound of something immense moving through the vegetation, not chasing us quickly, but moving with a certainty, an inevitability, as though it had all the time in the world to catch us because we would eventually tire. The visibility through the willows was poor, and in our panic we lost our bearings. We should have turned north and south, back toward open terrain. Instead, we turned west, deeper into the willow country, moving in a direction that the landscape seemed to pull us toward, as though the topology of the place itself was designed to keep intruders moving deeper into its heart. The ground beneath our feet became increasingly unstable. We were moving through boggy terrain now, where the earth did not feel solid, where each step threatened to plunge us into black water. Vegetation grew thicker. The willows were no longer scattered across open terrain, but formed a dense, nearly impenetrable barrier. And then the willows opened into a clearing, and we stopped, because there was nowhere left to run. The clearing was vast, easily a quarter-mile across, and every surface of open ground was covered with bones, not scattered randomly but arranged with deliberate precision. Larger bones, the structural supports of some vast skeleton, had been placed to create a pattern, a shape that almost suggested a picture or a word in a language that had no alphabet. Skulls lined the perimeter of the clearing in a circle that was nearly perfect. Most of them were animal skulls, but interspersed among them, at regular intervals, were human skulls. I counted 14 human skulls. Then I stopped counting because Amanda made a sound. She had dropped her rifle. She was looking at one of the skulls on the perimeter, about 30 meters to our left. I knew what she had seen before she spoke. "That is Frank Mitchell," she said. "He worked at the clinic. He went on a hiking trip to Denali 5 years ago. He was never found." The skull she was looking at still had hair, dark hair, matted and stained, but unmistakably the color of hair that had belonged to a human being, still attached to the bone, preserved by some process I could not comprehend. The thing emerged from the willows where we had entered the clearing. It was the same creature we had seen before, the same massive form with the wrong head and the impossible hands. It was no longer interested in chasing us. It had stopped about 50 meters away, and it was simply watching us, standing upright on those powerful hind legs, its chest heaving with exertion. William emerged from the willows behind it. He was moving differently now. His movements had become more fluid, more predatory. He looked at us across the clearing, and I understood that he was no longer William Rodriguez, that he had been hollowed out, and something else had moved in to animate his body. It was not the creature. It was something separate. It was a thing that wore William's body, the way a person wears a coat. The creature made a sound, and William made a sound in response, and they were making conversation in a language that existed below human speech, that belonged to something so far outside my experience that my brain could barely process that it was communication at all. The creature gestured toward us with one of those terrible hands. William began to walk toward us. Amanda grabbed my arm. "The radio," she said. "Call Michael. Call for help." I pulled the radio from my pack. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it. I pressed the transmit button. "Michael, this is base camp. We have an emergency. We are approximately 5 miles southwest of secondary camp. We need immediate evacuation." There was no response. I tried again. "Michael, respond. Jessica, Robert, anyone, respond." The radio was silent except for the constant hiss of white noise. William was walking closer. He was only 30 meters away now. His body was moving in that wrong way, the way the thing on the roof had moved, the way something wearing a human shape but not understanding how a human should move. "Run," I said to Amanda. We ran for the edge of the clearing. William did not chase us. He did not seem interested in stopping us. We crashed into the willows on the far side of the clearing, and we began to run in what I hoped was the direction of open terrain, in what I hoped was the direction of north and the ridges we had descended from. Time became strange. The running lasted minutes or hours or days. My legs moved without my conscious direction. My lungs burned. My vision began to tunnel from the edges. I was aware of Amanda somewhere to my left, still running, still making sounds, still alive. The willows began to thin. The density decreased. We could see further ahead. We began to see the ridges in the distance, the open slopes where the tundra was exposed to the sky. We did not stop running until we were on open ground, until we were more than a mile from the edge of the willow country. We collapsed on the rocky terrain, both of us gasping for breath, unable to speak, unable to do anything except survive the next moment. When I could finally speak, I asked Amanda if she thought we could make it back to the main cabin. She looked at me with eyes that had become something other than human eyes, that contained a knowledge they had not possessed this morning. "I think," she said slowly, "that the main cabin is exactly where it wants us to go." I understood what she meant. The thing in the willows, the creature that had claimed William, the intelligence that seemed to suffuse the entire park, it was not interested in killing us out here in the open terrain. It could do that any time. It was interested in hurting us, in moving us in specific directions, in directing us toward specific locations. We had walked into Denali as hunters. We were learning, very slowly and at terrible cost, that we had never been hunters at all. We began walking back toward the cabin as the false night settled over the landscape, the twilight deepening to its darkest phase, the sun sliding below the northern horizon for its brief seasonal absence. The light did not disappear entirely. It simply faded to a dusky gray that transformed the terrain into a landscape of shadows and suggestion. Amanda and I did not speak much during the journey. We followed the terrain we had walked through on our approach, navigating by memory and by the occasional use of our compass, both of us aware that we were not truly in control of our direction, that we were being allowed to move toward the cabin, that we were being herded like animals being moved toward an inevitable destination. We arrived at our secondary camp 14 hours after we had fled the clearing of bones. The camp was untouched. The supplies were still there. The radio was still on the tent shelf, broadcasting nothing but static. We did not rest. We gathered what we could carry, and we began the journey back toward the main cabin, moving through terrain that seemed familiar and strange at the same time, moving through a landscape that appeared to shift subtly whenever we looked away and looked back, that seemed to want us to take a very specific route home. That was when we encountered Michael and Robert. They were walking toward us, moving across a rocky slope that descended toward the valley where our secondary camp had been situated. They were alone. Jessica was not with them. They were both carrying rifles, but the weapons hung loose at their sides. They were walking with the steady, deliberate pace of men who knew exactly where they were going and why. When they reached us, Michael embraced me. He seemed genuinely happy to see us, genuinely pleased that we had survived, genuinely interested in our welfare. It was Michael, unmistakably Michael, with all the mannerisms and speech patterns that I had known for 6 years. But there was something in his eyes. There was a depth that had not been there before. "We have had an eventful experience," Michael said. His voice was perfectly normal, perfectly Michael. "We should return to the cabin. It will be more comfortable to discuss our findings in a secure location." "Where is Jessica?" Amanda asked. "Jessica is no longer with us," Robert said. He was also speaking normally, also moving normally, but his eyes held the same quality that I had seen in Michael's, a depth, an otherness. She found something in the higher elevations. She became very interested in it. She chose to stay. I understood what had happened. Jessica, competent and confident Jessica, had encountered the thing in the park in the same way that William had encountered it. She had looked into whatever it was that the thing was offering, and she had found that offer irresistible. She had chosen to stay. "We need to get to the ranger station," Amanda said. "We need to contact the authorities." Michael seemed amused by this suggestion. "The authorities," he repeated. "Yes, I think that is an excellent idea. Once we reach the cabin, we can use the radio to contact the ranger station. I am certain they will want to hear about our discoveries." We walked back to the cabin together, Michael and Robert on either side of me and Amanda, moving as a group, moving with a cohesion that felt almost companionable if you did not think too deeply about what it meant. The cabin appeared exactly as we had left it, solid and real and human in a way that nothing else in Denali seemed to be. The generator was still running. The supplies were still arranged on shelves. The logbook was still on the main table. Michael went directly to the radio. He turned it on and adjusted the frequency and began to speak. "This is base camp at the cabin near Teclanica River in Denali National Park, requesting emergency extraction for all personnel. We are ready for immediate evacuation." There was a pause. Then, to our surprise, a voice responded from the radio. A woman's voice, professional and calm. "Base camp, this is Ranger Station 7. We have been attempting to raise your group for 24 hours. We received an emergency call from Jessica Garcia, who reported injuries sustained from a fall. Her GPS location is approximately 12 miles northeast of your position. We have a team mobilizing to reach her. Are you prepared to provide more information on your situation?" Amanda immediately started to move toward the radio. Michael placed his hand on her arm and gently stopped her. "The situation is stable," Michael said into the radio. "All personnel are accounted for and unharmed. We will remain in place and await your arrival." "Copy that, base camp. Rangers will begin moving toward Jessica Garcia's location first. We will reach your cabin position within 18 hours. Stay in place and monitor this frequency." Michael turned off the radio. He looked at Amanda with an expression of such gentle certainty that I nearly believed everything was going to be all right. "Jessica is injured," Amanda said. "We need to help her." "Jessica is no longer injured," Robert said. "Jessica is becoming something better." I moved toward the door. I intended to walk out into the twilight, to walk away from the cabin, to put distance between myself and whatever was happening here. Michael caught my shoulder. "There is a storm coming," he said. He was pointing out the window to the north, where the sky was beginning to darken with an intensity that suggested weather was moving in. "It would be unwise to travel outside during a major storm. We should remain here until dawn. Then we can assess the situation." The thing about Michael was that he was right about things. He had always been right about things, and there was genuinely a storm coming, weather that was rolling down from the north with a speed that suggested it would arrive within an hour. So I agreed, and Amanda agreed, and we went to our rooms, and Michael and Robert began to prepare a meal, and the cabin became a place where 6 hunters sheltered against the approaching storm, except that 3 of them were no longer entirely human, and 2 of them knew this, and one of them, at this point in time, was existing in a state of profound denial. The storm arrived with the force of something that had been compressed and released. The wind hit the cabin with such intensity that I worried it might blow the structure down. Rain came in horizontal sheets. The generator faltered, recovered, faltered again. The power cut out entirely, and we were left with the light that came through the windows, light that was green and strange from the storm clouds that covered the sky. Michael and Robert lit lanterns. They seemed unperturbed by the weather, by the fact that the radio had stopped broadcasting anything except a loud burst of static, by the fact that we were essentially isolated now, cut off from contact with the world, dependent entirely on our supplies and our ability to survive until the weather cleared. I noticed for the first time that the windows of the cabin all faced outward, and I noticed for the second time that there was movement outside, visible between the heavy raindrops and the wind-driven spray. Something was moving in the space beyond the cabin walls, something large, something that the storm seemed to provide cover for, allowing it to move closer to the structure than it might otherwise do. Amanda was watching the windows. She had seen it too. Michael came to stand beside us. He placed a hand on my shoulder with casual affection, the way he might have done before all of this had happened, when he was still simply Michael Williams from the investment firm. "You should see what is outside," he said. I did not want to see what was outside. I absolutely did not want to look out those windows and see what the storm was concealing, what the darkness was revealing in flashes of lightning. But I found myself moving anyway, found myself drawn to the window as though there was a compulsion in the cabin itself, a pressure that was directing me toward specific actions. At the window, I looked out into the storm. There were dozens of them. No, there were hundreds. The creatures were surrounding the cabin on all sides, standing in the rain, standing upright on hind legs, their enormous forms silhouetted against the storm clouds when lightning flashed across the sky. They were every size, from smaller forms that might have been young to massive shapes that were almost invisible against the darkness because of their sheer magnitude. And among them, moving between them, standing upright on human legs, were people. People wearing clothes that were no longer clothes, people whose bodies were beginning to transition into forms that were other than human, people who had been in the park longer than weeks, people who had been collected and transformed over months and years. I recognized some of the faces. William was among them, standing calmly in the rain as though the weather was not affecting him at all. Jessica was there, her body already beginning to shift, her hands already showing the elongation of the fingers. There were others, people I did not recognize, people who must have come to the park and never left, people whose transformation was complete or nearly complete, people who now stood at an intermediate stage between what they had been and what they were becoming. Patricia Hendricks was among them. She was standing very close to the cabin window, as though she was looking in at me, her face pressed against the glass. Her features were wrong now. The shape of her skull had altered. But her eyes were recognizable, and they were looking at me with an expression of such profound sorrow that I had to turn away from the window. "They are waiting," Robert said. His voice was patient and gentle. "They have been waiting for you to understand. The rain will stop eventually. The storm will pass. When it does, you will have to choose." "Choose what?" I whispered. "Whether you will remain as you are," Michael said, "or whether you will step outside and join them." I looked at Amanda. She was still staring out the window, watching the creatures and the transformed people, her jaw clenched, her hands in fists at her sides. "This is not real," she said. "This is a psychological episode. This is some kind of mass delusion." "It is as real as you need it to be," Michael replied. The storm lasted through the night. We did not sleep. We sat in the main room of the cabin, and Michael and Robert sat with us, and they told us stories about the thing that lived in the willows in the park. They told us that it had always been there, long before Denali became a national park, long before humans had built their ranger stations and their lodges and their tourist facilities. It had always been there, waiting in the spaces between the ridges, breeding and growing and periodically reaching out to collect people and make them part of something larger. They told us that every person who went missing in Denali did not simply vanish. They were transformed. They were given the opportunity to become something other than human, something more adapted to the landscape, something that belonged to this place in a way that human beings could never belong. They told us that the transformation was not painful. It was not a violation. It was an invitation. And those who accepted the invitation found that they no longer desired the things that human beings desired. They no longer felt fear or shame or the desire to dominate. They became part of a collective consciousness that had no need for individual identity, that experienced existence as a constant communication with all the other transformed individuals, that existed in a state of continuous understanding and connection. You could have that, Michael said. All you have to do is walk outside when the storm ends. Or you could resist, Robert said. You could fight it. You could refuse the invitation, but understand that refusing comes with consequences. When dawn came, when the storm had passed and the rain had stopped, and the sky was beginning to lighten with that pale Alaskan morning light, the creatures and the transformed people were gone. The landscape surrounding the cabin was empty. There was no sign that anything had been out there. No tracks, no evidence, nothing to suggest that the night had not simply been a dream that Amanda and I had shared while we slept. Michael made breakfast. Robert repaired the generator and restored power to the cabin. The radio crackled back to life, broadcasting nothing but static. "The Rangers will arrive sometime today," Michael said. "When they do, you will tell them that the expedition was successful. You will tell them that Robert and I are departing early to return to Anchorage, and that you and Amanda will remain here to complete the trip. You will tell them that William and Jessica are fine, that they are simply recovering from exhaustion in their rooms." "We will not say that," Amanda said. "You will," Michael said. His voice had not changed, had not taken on any tone of menace, but the certainty in it was absolute. "Because if you do not, if you tell the Rangers anything about what you have experienced, they will not believe you. They will assume you have suffered from some kind of altitude sickness or psychological breakdown. They will remove you from the park and perhaps recommend psychiatric evaluation. And then, the next time they send a search and rescue team into the Willows to look for evidence, the thing that lives here will collect them too." He paused, allowing this to sink in. "But if you cooperate, if you leave this place and return to your life and say nothing about what you have seen, the thing in the Willows will leave you alone. It does not require your transformation. It simply requires your silence." Amanda was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "What will you do?" "Robert and I will walk into the Willows," Michael said. "We will join the others. We will accept the transformation that is already beginning to take place within us. We will become part of something ancient and infinite. It is not a bad thing, Amanda. It is the only thing." She did not respond. Neither did I. The Rangers arrived 8 hours later, coming by helicopter, landing in a clearing near the cabin. They came with emergency medical equipment and an attitude of concern that seemed almost quaint now, given what we knew about the park, given what we understood about the nature of the place we had been walking through. Michael and Robert greeted them with perfect politeness. They explained that they were feeling fatigued and wished to return to Anchorage early to rest. The Rangers, seeing 2 men who appeared healthy and unharmed, accepted this without question. They asked about Jessica and William. "Jessica is resting," Amanda said, and the lie came out perfectly. "She fell and injured her leg. She is recovering. William is sleeping. We gave him something to help him rest from the stress of the expedition." The ranger in charge, a woman whose name tag read Martinez, seemed satisfied with this explanation. She had only been authorized to extract Jessica Garcia and ensure that the base group was unharmed. The helicopter had limited space. Michael and Robert and the pilot made it to Anchorage. Amanda and I remained at the cabin. That was the last time I saw Michael Williams. That was the last time I saw Robert Wilson. When they walked away from the helicopter, moving toward the Willows, moving toward the trees, they did not look back. They simply walked into the spaces between the vegetation, and the vegetation seemed to open for them, and they disappeared into the landscape. The Rangers offered to extract Amanda and me immediately. We had suffered a trauma. We were isolated. They could have us in Anchorage by evening. We refused. We told them we wanted to complete the expedition, to remain in the cabin as we had planned. The ranger named Martinez seemed concerned about this, but she did not have the authority to force us to leave. She made us swear that we would remain in contact via radio and that we would call for immediate evacuation if anything seemed amiss. We swore. The helicopter lifted off. It carried with it the last thread of connection to the world outside the park, the last hope of rescue, the last chance to simply leave this place and pretend that what we had experienced was not real. Amanda and I stood outside the cabin and watched the helicopter disappear into the sky. Then we went inside, and we closed the door, and we began the final phase of our time in Denali. Time became strange in the cabin after the Rangers left. A day felt like an hour, or an hour felt like a day. I could not trust my perception of duration anymore. My watch continued to measure time in the conventional way, but that measurement seemed almost irrelevant to the actual experience of existence. Amanda and I existed in a state of profound waiting. We were waiting for something to come. We were waiting for a decision to impose itself upon us. We were waiting for the thing in the willows to make its next move. The cabin felt different now that we were truly alone. It felt like a stomach, and we were inside it, being slowly digested. It felt like a mouth, and the door and windows were its teeth, keeping the outside at bay. It felt alive in a way that architecture should not feel alive. I began to read the logbook in earnest, searching through all the entries from the past 3 years, looking for patterns, looking for evidence, looking for some kind of understanding of what had been collecting people in Denali. The entries became increasingly sparse as I moved forward in time. Fewer people were visiting the cabin. Fewer expeditions were being organized. It was as though word had spread in some way, through some channel of communication I did not understand, that the park had become hazardous. Or perhaps people simply realized, on some level below conscious thought, that Denali was not a place for human beings to visit anymore, that we were no longer welcome in this landscape. The final entry in the logbook was dated 5 days before our arrival. It had been written by a man named Michael Williams. I read these words in a handwriting that I recognized immediately, though I had never seen Michael's handwriting in the logbook before. I have come to understand the nature of the place. I have come to understand what lives here and what it wants. I have come to understand what I am meant to become. Tomorrow, my group will arrive. The thing in the willows has been patient. It has been collecting individuals for decades. This time, it has arranged everything perfectly. 6 will enter, 4 will leave confused, 2 will understand, 1 will accept. I do not know which person I will be, but I know that one of us will choose correctly. I know that one of us will walk into the willows and never emerge as human again. That person will be me. This is my last entry as Michael Williams. The next person who writes in this book will be writing about me, writing about what I became. I closed the logbook. I did not show it to Amanda. Some things I had come to understand were better not shared. On the 4th day after the Rangers left, we heard the sound again. It came from the willows, that hybrid shriek that belonged to no animal and every animal at the same time. But this time it was different. This time it was calling. It was a sound designed to draw us toward it, to make us want to move in its direction. Amanda heard it too. She looked at me, and I could see the conflict in her face. She was fighting something, some impulse that was growing stronger with each passing hour. I recognized it because I was fighting the same impulse. "Do not listen to it," she said, but her voice was weak. "I am not listening," I replied. "It is thinking at us. It is thinking directly into our minds." That was the truth that I had come to understand. The thing in the willows did not communicate through sound alone. It communicated through direct neural transmission, through a pressure in the skull, through a compulsion that operated below the level of conscious thought. Every time that sound came from the willows, it brought with it a message, and the message was the same. Come outside. Accept the transformation. Become part of us. Cease to be alone. Humans are not meant to be alone. Even those of us who live in isolation, even those of us who prefer solitude, carry with us an understanding that we are individuals in a larger group. We are designed for communication and community. We are designed for the presence of other minds. The thing in the willows was offering something that no human society could ever offer. It was offering the complete elimination of isolation, the complete dissolution of the boundary between self and other, the merger of individual consciousness into a larger collective mind. It was offering the end of loneliness, and it was doing this to creatures, humans, whose greatest fear is the experience of being alone. On the fifth day, Amanda went to stand at the window of the cabin, and she did not come back. I found her at the edge of the willows, standing perfectly still, her body oriented toward the vegetation, her hands hanging at her sides. She did not respond when I called her name. She did not acknowledge my presence. She was simply standing there, listening to something that only she could hear, receiving a communication that I was not being granted access to. I tried to pull her back toward the cabin. She resisted with a strength that was not consistent with her physical frame. She was already becoming something other than human. The transformation did not require the dramatic alteration that Michael and Robert and William had experienced. It could happen more subtly, could begin with a change in the quality of attention, with a reorientation of will, with a gradual dissolution of the boundary between self and environment. "Let go," she said. Her voice was peaceful. "It is not painful. It is not wrong. It is the only thing that makes sense." I did not let go. I pulled her back toward the cabin by main force, and she did not resist after the initial effort, as though she had decided that it was not worth the energy to fight me, as though she had already made her decision and my intervention was merely delaying the inevitable. I locked her in her room. She did not protest. She did not call out. She simply lay on her cot, looking at the ceiling, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. The knocking began on the sixth day. It came at the door to the cabin, a slow, patient knocking, as though someone was standing outside and politely requesting entry. I did not open the door. I prepared for what I assumed would be some kind of assault, some attempt to break down the barrier and take Amanda out into the willows. But the thing that was knocking was not trying to force its way inside. It was simply knocking, waiting for me to open the door, patient and inexorable. "Open the door," Amanda called from her room. "You cannot keep it out. It will always find a way in." She was right, but I did not open the door. The knocking continued for hours. At one point, I heard William's voice on the other side of the door. "It is so much better than you think," William said. "There is no pain. There is no regret. There is only understanding and peace." I did not open the door. Later, I heard Michael's voice. "You are being foolish," Michael said. His voice was patient, reasonable, the voice he had used in countless business meetings. "You cannot survive this. You cannot remain human and remain in this place. One of these two things must happen. Either you will open the door and accept what we offer, or you will find some other way to end this, and then you will end, not become part of us, but simply end. Is that what you want?" I did not answer. I did not open the door. On the seventh day, the knocking stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. I went to check on Amanda. She was still in her room, still looking at the ceiling, still waiting. "I can feel them," she said. "They are inside my head. They are so patient. They have been patient for millions of years, waiting for us to evolve into the state of being where we can hear them. They have been here since before the continents formed. They will be here after the continents sink into the ocean. They are teaching me things. They are showing me what comes after." "After what?" I asked. "After humanity. After all of this. They have collected enough of us. They have enough genetic material, enough neural patterns, enough understanding of what we are to not need more. They are going to close the door now. Denali is going to stop accepting new entrances. The park is going to become a closed system, and those of us inside will begin the real transformation, the slow cultivation into a different form of being." "How long?" I asked. "Does time matter anymore?" Amanda replied. I left her there. I did not know what else to do. On the eighth day, the power failed. The generator simply stopped working, and this time it did not restart. The lanterns provided enough light for the evenings, but I was aware that time was running short, that the communication I should have made with the ranger station had not been made, that no one in the outside world was monitoring our situation. I attempted to repair the generator. I found that the fuel line had been severed, cut cleanly with something sharp. The generator itself appeared undamaged, but it could not run without fuel. This had been done deliberately, I understood. The supplies were not limitless. I had perhaps 2 weeks of food remaining, if I rationed carefully. After that, I would face a choice: attempt to survive by hunting and gathering in Denali, in a landscape that wanted me to fail, or do something else. On the 10th day, I found Amanda's room empty. She had not broken down the door. There was no sign of struggle. She had simply ceased to be in the room. A window that had been locked from the inside stood open. I ran outside, calling her name, but the landscape was empty. There was no sign of her. There was no body. There was simply absence, and with absence the knowledge that she had chosen to leave, that she had walked into the willows and accepted what was being offered. I was alone in the cabin. I was alone in the landscape. I was alone in the park. That night the knocking came again, but now it was different. This time, when something knocked on the door, it was knocking with Amanda's hands. I could hear the sound she would make if she was standing outside, the breathing pattern, the way she had shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "Let me in," Amanda said from the other side of the door. "You cannot keep me out. I am already inside the cabin. I am already inside your mind. I have been inside you since the clearing of bones. Since the moment you saw the thing in the willows, it has been inside you, and I am part of it, and it is part of me. And soon you will stop fighting and let us all become one." I did not open the door. I stood in the center of the cabin, in the darkness, listening to Amanda's voice calling me from outside, and I understood that this was the test. This was the moment where I would either walk outside and accept the transformation, or I would refuse, and by refusing, I would accept something else. The thing was right about one thing. Humans are not meant to be alone, but humans are also meant to remain human, and that is a kind of alone that nothing else in the universe can replace. I waited until the knocking stopped. When it did, I took one of the lanterns, and I looked around the cabin one final time, and I made a choice that was less about acceptance and more about rebellion. I burned the cabin down. I used the lamp oil and the fuel from the lanterns. I doused the main room, the bedroom, the storage areas. I moved through the cabin like a ghost, completing tasks that seemed to belong to someone else, to a person I had been before the willows had opened into clearing and shown me the bones. The fire started easily. It spread with a speed that suggested the wood had been treated with something flammable, or perhaps the thing in the willows was helping it burn, was eager to remove this human structure, this human barrier, from its territory. I walked out of the cabin as the flames were reaching the roof. I did not look back. Behind me, the structure collapsed in on itself, burning with an intensity that suggested it was being consumed from the inside by something that was also burning, that was also feeding the fire. The smoke rose into the pale sky. I watched it for a moment, watching my last connection to human shelter disappear into the atmosphere, and then I turned and began to walk away from the burning cabin, toward open terrain, toward terrain that did not contain willows. I expected something to stop me. I expected the thing in the willows to make a final attempt to collect me, to transform me, to add my neural pattern to its collective consciousness. But nothing stopped me. The landscape simply allowed me to walk away, as though I had ceased to matter, as though my refusal to accept the transformation had somehow made me uninteresting, invisible, beneath the notice of whatever force had been trying to claim me. I walked through Denali for 3 days, without the benefit of the cabin, without supplies, without any of the equipment that humans use to survive in remote wilderness. I survived because the place allowed me to survive, because I was no longer a threat to whatever intelligence inhabited the park, because I had been diminished by my resistance. On the 3rd day, I encountered a ranger. He was alone, moving through the terrain with the competence of someone who knew the park well, someone who belonged here in a way that the hunters belonged here. He saw me and recognized immediately that I was in a state beyond normal exhaustion. "Are you part of the Williams expedition?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "What is your status? Where are the rest of your group?" I did not know how to answer this. I could not tell him the truth. I could not explain what I had experienced, what I had witnessed, what had happened to William and Michael and Robert and Jessica and Amanda. He would not believe me. More importantly, if he did not believe me, He might organize a rescue mission. He might send teams into the Willows to search for the missing members of our group, and if he did, the thing in the Willows would collect them too. They chose to extend their expedition, I told him. They are fine. They sent me back to the cabin to retrieve additional supplies, but I became disoriented on my return. I have been walking for several days trying to regain my bearings. The ranger, whose name was James Corbett, seemed skeptical of this explanation, but he did not press the matter. He shared his water and some trail food. He helped me back to the nearest ranger station. I spent 2 days being interrogated by various personnel from the Park Service. I maintained my story. I said nothing about the creature. I said nothing about the Willows. I said nothing about William becoming something other than human, or Michael choosing to walk into the vegetation. They contacted the cabin via radio and received no response. They organized a search and rescue team. I was asked if I wanted to join them. I said no. I said I was exhausted and needed to rest. They flew a helicopter to Anchorage. I went with it. The search team entered Denali looking for the missing members of the Williams expedition. They found the remains of the cabin, burned down in a way that suggested an accidental fire. They found no other evidence of the hunters. They found no bodies, no blood, no indication of what had happened to the 4 people who had disappeared. Their official report attributed the fire to negligence and overheating of the generator. They could not explain the disappearances, but their best assessment was that William Rodriguez had probably suffered some kind of cardiac event while hiking, and the others had become lost trying to locate him. The park can swallow people. It happens sometimes. The search and rescue team could do nothing but accept the absence and move forward. No one asked too many questions. No one attempted to suggest foul play or anything unusual. People went missing in the Alaskan wilderness regularly. Denali, in particular, had claimed the lives of hundreds of adventurers over the decades. 6 people entering the park and 4 leaving seemed like a reasonable percentage of loss. I have spent the past 2 years living in Anchorage. I work in a field that does not require me to interact with many people. I do not sleep well. I do not trust the darkness. I do not go hiking. More importantly, I have continued to receive communications from the thing in the Willows. They come in different forms. Sometimes they come as dreams, and I wake with the knowledge that I have been touching minds with the transformed members of our expedition, that I have been communicating with the collective consciousness that William and Michael and Robert and Jessica and Amanda have merged into. Sometimes they come as compulsions, sudden urges to drive north toward the park, to walk into the wilderness, to find that cabin site again or whatever has grown in its place. Most often they come in the spaces between waking and sleeping, in the state of consciousness where humans are most vulnerable to suggestion, most open to the idea that the boundaries of self are permeable, that the distinction between one mind and another is not as fundamental as we believe it to be. The thing in the Willows has not stopped trying to collect me. It has simply changed its approach. It is no longer attempting to force my transformation. It is simply waiting for me to choose, to eventually reach a point of such psychological exhaustion that the idea of surrendering to the collective consciousness becomes attractive. I do not know how much longer I can maintain my separation. I do not know if my refusal is strength or simply delayed surrender. What I do know is that Amanda was right about one thing. The thing in the Willows is inside me now. It entered me the moment I saw it in the clearing of bones. It entered me when I felt the pressure of its attention. It entered me when I resisted its transformation, and now it shares my body with me, not in the aggressive way that it shares the bodies of those who have accepted it, but as a presence, a passenger, a consciousness waiting for the moment when I will be too tired to resist anymore. I do not know how to end this narrative. I do not know how to bring closure to a story that does not have an ending. I only know that I am still here, in Anchorage, still working, still maintaining the appearance of a functioning human being, while something ancient and patient and infinite waits inside my skull for me to surrender. The mountain is still there. Denali rises above the landscape, indifferent to humans and their small dramas, ancient and timeless and utterly inhospitable to human life. And in the willows beneath its slopes, the transformation continues. The collective consciousness grows. New members are added with each passing season as hikers and hunters and adventurers venture into the park seeking experience, seeking challenge, seeking truth. Most of them do not return. Some of them return changed, and some of them, like me, return still maintaining the shape of humanity while something else inhabits the hollow spaces beneath the skin. I do not know what advice to give to those who read this account. I do not know whether to warn people away from Denali or to suggest that they are welcome to visit, as long as they understand that they are not truly exploring nature, but rather being explored by it, that they are not venturing into wilderness, but into the territory of something that predates wilderness, that antedates the park and the state and the nation. All I know is that I hear the sound sometimes, even here in the city, even in the middle of the night when I am surrounded by millions of other humans. I hear that hybrid shriek that sounds like an animal, and like a man, and like something else entirely. And sometimes I wonder if I am hearing it in the night sky above Anchorage, or if I am hearing it in my own mind, broadcast from some deep place that I cannot reach but can always feel. The transformation is ongoing. The park is patient. The thing in the willows is infinite, and I am slowly learning not to fight it. I need to tell you about what happened during that final summer when everything changed for us. Not because anyone asked me to, not because I think anyone will believe me, but because silence has become a weight I can no longer carry, and the truth deserves at least one witness willing to speak it into existence. My name does not matter. What matters is that I was there. I saw what no one should see. I lived through what most people pray they will never experience. 7 of us gathered at the edge of a state preserve in late July, the kind of place where the mountains still held their ancient secrets, where the forest grew so thick that sunlight became a rare commodity. Michelle Robinson organized the trip, as she always did. She was the type of woman who believed that nature had a way of healing people, of stripping away the false parts of ourselves and revealing what lay underneath. She believed that suffering could be cured by exposure, by facing the wild on its own terms. We were all skeptical when she first mentioned it. Kevin Walker, her husband of 22 years, rolled his eyes at the proposal. Angela Young, his mother, expressed her usual collection of concerns about bears and contaminated water sources. Brian Allen made jokes about needing civilization and electricity. Melissa King laughed about her own poor physical condition. Eric Wright said nothing, which was his way of saying he had already decided to come. Christina Scott agreed immediately, which surprised no one who knew her. There were supposed to be 6 of us originally. The 7th person was added at the last moment when Eric mentioned a friend who needed to get away from the city. That 7th person is why I am telling you this story now. That 7th person changed everything. The preserve itself had a reputation among locals, though Michelle had carefully avoided mentioning that detail when she first proposed the trip. The rangers who worked there would speak in careful, measured tones about the area. They would tell you about the unusual animal activity, about the livestock that occasionally went missing from nearby properties, about the tracks that appeared in snow and mud that did not match any known creatures native to the region. They would mention these things as interesting curiosities, the way someone might comment on unusual weather patterns, but if you listened closely enough, you could hear the reluctance in their voices. You could sense the things they were not saying. I should have asked more questions. If I had paid attention to those hesitations, to the careful word choices, perhaps I could have prevented what came next. But that is the luxury of hindsight, and hindsight is a gift that only arrives too late. We arrived at the preserve on a Thursday morning in mid-July. The weather was perfect, the kind of summer day that feels like an insult to the darkness that sometimes lives in the world. Michelle had rented a large cabin about 2 miles from the preserve proper, though we planned to spend most of our time hiking the various trails that cut through the hundreds of acres of protected forest. The cabin sat isolated, separated from its nearest neighbor by at least 3 miles of dense woodland. It had electricity and running water, which made Michelle's philosophy of roughing it a somewhat comfortable affair. The porch looked out over a small clearing, beyond which the forest reasserted its dominance. Ancient trees rose like monuments, their trunks thick enough that 3 people holding hands could not have wrapped around them. Michelle walked us through the cabin as though she were showing off a prize she had won. Here is where we would cook. Here is where we would gather in the evenings. Here are the sleeping arrangements, which she had worked out to ensure that no one would feel isolated during the nights. She believed in the psychological safety of proximity, in the ancient human understanding that we are smaller and weaker in darkness. The forest has a sound all its own, not the birds and insects you hear during the day, but something deeper, something that moves through the trees like a living thing. On that first night, we sat on the porch and listened to that sound. Michelle called it the breath of nature. Eric called it settling wood and distant wind. I wondered if it had a name at all, or if some sounds simply existed beyond the ability of language to capture them. It was Brian who first asked about the seventh person. This friend that Eric had mentioned, the one who supposedly needed the escape from city life. None of us had heard anything about this plan until Eric casually mentioned it during dinner on that first evening. His name is Marshall, Eric said simply. He is going through a difficult time. I thought this trip might help. Michelle seemed pleased with this addition to the group dynamic, another soul seeking healing through exposure to nature. Angela Young expressed some concerns about accommodations, but there was space enough. Melissa King asked practical questions about food supplies. We were not suspicious. We did not ask ourselves why Eric would add someone to this trip without discussing it with the primary organizer. We did not wonder why Eric seemed reluctant to provide details about Marshall. We did not pay attention to the way Kevin's jaw tightened when Eric mentioned the name. These were the first mistakes that led to everything that followed. Marshall arrived the next morning in a vehicle that was old enough to seem deliberately chosen for its state of disrepair. He was thin, unusually thin, with a quality to his appearance that suggested he had recently experienced something that demanded a great deal from his body. His eyes were the first thing you noticed about him. They had a darkness to them that was not simple matter of color, but something that seemed to sit behind them, watching, evaluating. Michelle welcomed him with the kind of genuine warmth she offered to strangers. She believed that hospitality was a form of healing, both for the giver and the recipient. Marshall accepted this warmth with a slight smile, the kind of expression that revealed nothing about what he might be thinking or feeling. Eric seemed relieved by Marshall's arrival, which was strange in its own way. Most people carry tension into potentially awkward social situations. Eric carried the opposite, a kind of settled rightness that suggested he had been waiting for something to happen and was grateful it had finally occurred. We spent that second day hiking one of the easier trails that cut through the southern portion of the preserve. Marshall kept pace with the group, moving through the forest with an ease that suggested he had spent considerable time in wild places. He said very little. He mostly watched, his eyes tracking movement in the trees, his attention caught by sounds that the rest of us barely registered. On that second evening, while Michelle and Angela prepared dinner and Kevin attended to the fire in the stone fireplace, I found myself in a conversation with Marshall that I did not remember initiating. "You have questions," he said. It was not a question posed to me. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of someone who had looked inside my mind and found exactly what he expected to find there. "About what?" I asked, though I knew perfectly well what he meant. "About why I am here. About why Eric brought me. About whether I am trustworthy." He turned his attention away from the forest and toward me, and in that moment, I felt something shift in the space between us. "You are right to question these things. Very right." "Then why did he bring you?" I asked directly. Marshall smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who had just confirmed something they had suspected all along. "Because he wanted to see if it was still true," Marshall said quietly. "Whether the old ways still worked, whether the exchange of one life for another still carried the same weight it once did." Before I could ask him what he meant by that cryptic statement, Melissa called out that dinner was ready. Marshall stood smoothly and walked toward the cabin without another word. But his statement had taken root in my mind, and no amount of warmth from the fireplace or comfort from good food could dislodge it. That night, I did not sleep well. The wind moved through the trees with an intensity that seemed personal, as though it were testing the cabin itself, searching for weak points and entry routes. Somewhere deep in the forest, something was moving. I could hear it in the way the other animals had gone quiet, in the absence of the smaller sounds that usually fill the darkness. By the third day, the dynamics of our group had become noticeably strained. Michelle noticed it, though she chose to interpret it as the natural tension that arises when 7 people share close quarters. She suggested a more ambitious hike, a longer trail that would take us deeper into the preserve and away from the immediate vicinity of the cabin. "There is an old ranger station about 8 miles in," she said, consulting a map she had acquired from the preserve office. "We could reach it by afternoon, spend some time there, and return before dark." Kevin was reluctant. He expressed concerns about time management and weather. But Michelle's enthusiasm was difficult to resist. She had already decided that this was what we would do, and her certainty had a way of overriding everyone else's doubts. Marshall asked a single question. "Is that station still staffed?" Michelle checked her notes. "Not during the summer season," she said. "The ranger assigned to this preserve covers a much wider territory. The station is primarily used as a shelter for hikers and as a storage point for equipment." Marshall nodded, as though this information confirmed something he had already suspected. He did not voice any objections to the plan. We set out that morning, around 7 o'clock, carrying backpacks with water and food, wearing the kind of clothing we believed would protect us from the elements and the occasional scratch from undergrowth. Eric and Marshall walked together, their conversation kept just low enough that the rest of us could not hear it. Angela Young struggled with the pace Michelle had set, but pride kept her from complaining. She was a woman from a generation that did not readily admit weakness, particularly not to younger women who seemed to be thriving in conditions that exhausted her. The trail itself was well maintained in its lower sections, marked with faded paint on trees and occasional signs, but as we climbed higher and ventured deeper into the forest, those markers became less frequent. The forest grew thicker, more substantial. The canopy overhead was so dense that midday felt like twilight. The temperature dropped noticeably even as our exertion increased. Around midday, we encountered the first clear indication that something was wrong. The carcass of a deer hung from a tree about 50 feet from the trail. There was nothing natural about how it had been positioned. The animal was suspended perhaps 10 feet up the trunk, and the way it had been arranged suggested intentionality, purpose. Brian noticed it first and made an attempt at a joke, something about teenagers playing pranks, but his voice carried a quality that suggested he knew his explanation was insufficient. Christina moved closer to examine the animal more carefully. She had a background in wildlife management before she had taken the job that had brought her to the preserve. She knew what the wild did to animals, and this was not the work of any natural predator she could identify. "That did not die here," she said finally. "This was placed here, deliberately." Marshall looked at the carcass with a kind of detached interest that someone might show when examining an architectural blueprint. Eric stood very still, his eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the dead animal. Michelle wanted to continue moving forward. The ranger station was still hours away, she reasoned, and stopping to worry about dead animals was not what we had come here to do. Melissa agreed, mentioning something about how wild places contained wild occurrences that humans were simply not equipped to fully understand. But something had shifted in the group's consciousness. The casual comfort we had carried during the early morning had evaporated. Now we moved with heightened awareness, our conversations reduced to necessary information exchanges. The forest no longer felt like a place of natural beauty. It felt like a space we were passing through on sufferance, like guests in someone else's home, who were gradually becoming aware that their presence was not actually welcome. The ranger station, when we finally reached it in the late afternoon, was a small structure built from split logs and weathered wood. It had been painted green once, long enough ago that the paint had faded to the color of old moss. The door hung slightly ajar, moving gently in a breeze that did not seem to affect anything else around it. Michelle pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The rest of us followed, though I was acutely aware of how cramped the space became once all 7 of us had entered. There was a bunk bed in one corner, a small table and 2 chairs, some shelving with emergency supplies, and a large book in which rangers recorded observations and maintenance notes. Michelle opened that book with genuine excitement, expecting to find recorded evidence of the wildlife that populated the preserve. What she found instead was something that stopped her hands mid-page. The most recent entry was dated only 3 days earlier. It was written in a careful, deliberate hand. The pattern continues. 7 reported missing from the preserve in the past month. 2 bodies recovered, though recovery is not quite the correct term. The animals bring the bodies back. They arrange them deliberately. This is not predation. This is a message. The rangers have stopped coming. I cannot explain what I have seen without losing credibility with the department. I am submitting my resignation, effective immediately. Anyone reading this should leave this place. This preserve is not safe. Whatever walks here, it does not see us as we see ourselves. Michelle read the entry aloud, her voice becoming quieter with each sentence. When she finished, she closed the book, as though the act of closure might somehow contain what it had just revealed. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the forest outside seemed to hold its breath. It was Eric who broke that silence, and what he said changed everything about the way we understood why we were really here. That was written by the previous ranger, he said quietly. David Corbett. He quit about 2 weeks after Marshall contacted him. He told Marshall everything about this place, about what hunts here. We all turned to look at Marshall, who met our stares with an expression of complete calm, as though he had been expecting this moment and had prepared for it. Why? Michelle asked, her voice carrying an edge of anger. Why would you involve us in whatever this is? Because the pattern needs to continue, Marshall said simply. Because 7 is the number that was demanded. Because Eric made an exchange that required fulfillment, and this place is where such things can be properly observed. Kevin moved toward Marshall with sudden aggression, his hands curled into fists. But Eric stepped between them, his body language projecting a kind of apology that was too late to matter. I had to, Eric said to Kevin directly. You know what happened. You know what the doctors said was impossible, and yet it happened anyway. My daughter was going to die. The treatment was not working. Nothing was working. And then there was Marshall offering a solution, an exchange. One life for another, a necessary balance. Your daughter is alive because someone in this group dies? Christina asked, her voice shaking. Is that what you are telling us? Not someone from the group, Marshall corrected gently. Someone chosen by the preserve itself. The thing that hunts here needs to eat. It needs to maintain a certain balance with its environment. But when that hunger is magnified, when it is given permission to feed without the usual restrictions, then it will choose carefully. It will take the one most suited to its purposes, the one whose presence most clearly represents an imbalance in the natural order. You are describing murder, Melissa said flatly. You are describing a ritual murder. I am describing an exchange, Marshall said, the oldest kind, life for life, a fundamental principle that exists in every culture that understands the true nature of reality. The thing in these woods is old, older than the land it inhabits. It is patient, it is intelligent, and it is hungry in ways that you do not have the capacity to fully comprehend. Angela Young sank into one of the chairs, her face suddenly very old. She had lived through enough of the world to recognize when someone was speaking a truth that most people could not afford to believe. How long have we been here? She asked quietly. How long does it wait before it decides? It already knows, Marshall said. It knows the moment we entered its territory. It is watching us right now, and by sunset it will have decided. We decided to return to the cabin immediately, though none of us believed that distance would offer any genuine protection. Michelle attempted rational argument about vehicle availability and the danger of hiking in fading light, but even she seemed to understand that the ranger station offered no safety, only the false comfort of walls and a roof. The return journey took on the quality of a nightmare, where movement itself becomes an act of resistance. The forest had changed, or perhaps it had always been this way, and only now were we seeing it clearly. The shadows between trees were not empty spaces, but places where things gathered and waited. The sounds that had seemed natural and unremarkable during our initial hike now carried meaning, intention, purpose. Marshall and Eric led the group, moving with the confidence of people who believed they knew where they were going. The rest of us followed in a tight cluster, no one willing to fall behind or move too far ahead. Melissa walked beside me for part of the journey. Her breathing labored from exertion and fear. "We could run," she said quietly during one of our brief rest stops. "We could split up and run in different directions. At least some of us might survive." "It would make no difference," I said, though I had no basis for certainty in what I was saying. "Marshall said it has already decided, and if it is as old and intelligent as he claims, then attempting to escape would only make things worse." She nodded, though I could see that she was not comforted by this logic. She was a practical woman, accustomed to controlling outcomes through force of will and good planning. The idea of complete helplessness, of being trapped in a situation where survival was not a matter of individual agency, but rather of being selected or passed over, was something her mind could not quite accommodate. We reached the cabin just as the sun touched the western horizon. The clearing around the structure looked smaller in the fading light, as though the forest was gradually compressing inward, reducing the space we could claim as safety. The cabin itself looked remarkably fragile, nothing more than thin wood and glass standing between us and whatever moved in the darkness beyond. Michelle attempted to convince us that we should maintain normalcy. "We should prepare dinner," she suggested. "We should sit together and discuss what Marshall had told us, rationally and logically. We should consider calling the authorities," though even she seemed to recognize that this suggestion was somewhat hollow. What would we tell them? That a person had been exchanged through some kind of supernatural transaction? That an ancient entity was now hunting us in a state preserve? Eric refused to participate in this pretense of normalcy. He went to the bedroom he was sharing with Marshall and did not emerge until the sun had fully set. When he did appear, his expression was one of profound weariness, as though he had just completed a conversation that had drained something essential from him. Christina suggested that we lock ourselves in the cabin and not emerge until daylight. It was a reasonable precaution, though reasonable precautions seemed inadequate when confronted with something that was fundamentally unreasonable in its nature and origin. As darkness settled fully across the clearing, the sounds began. At first they were distant, the movement of large animals through the forest, the crack of fallen branches, the displacement of earth and stone. But they grew steadily closer, circling the cabin in what seemed to be a deliberate pattern. We gathered in the main room, all 7 of us, waiting for something that we could not see and could not predict. Angela Young sat in a chair, facing the front window, her hands folded in her lap, her face the mask of someone who had finally encountered a truth that she had always known must exist. Melissa stood near the kitchen, her practical mind clearly working through scenarios, searching for a solution that simply did not exist. Kevin moved restlessly between rooms, checking locks and windows, performing actions that made him feel less helpless, even though they offered no genuine security. Christina asked Marshall directly what the thing was, what it had been before it came to this preserve, whether it had a name. Marshall seemed willing to answer these questions, as though their asking represented a necessary part of whatever ritual this entire situation had become. "It has been called many things," he said, "by people who lived on these lands before this country existed, by the early settlers who wrote accounts of missing livestock and missing people, by the rangers who tried to explain what they had witnessed within rational frameworks that proved inadequate. But the oldest name, the one that carries the most accuracy, is Skinwalker, a thing that can move between forms, between states of being, a creature that lives on the border between hunger and intention, that has learned to feed on human beings in ways that go beyond mere sustenance." "How is it possible?" Christina demanded. "How can something like that exist without the entire world knowing about it? How can science ignore something so fundamental?" Marshall smiled with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "Science requires reproducible observation and repeatable experimentation. This thing appears on its own schedule, according to principles that do not align with the neat categories that humans have created. It is seen only by those it permits to see it, or those it selects to teach a final lesson, and those people either die here or they leave, carrying a silence with them that is more absolute than any command could enforce. Because they understand that speaking about what they witnessed would end their credibility, their relationships, their acceptance within normal society. So they stay silent. and the thing in the forest continues its long existence in obscurity. The sounds outside grew closer as the hours progressed. By midnight, they were directly against the cabin, circling its perimeter with a deliberation that suggested intelligence and malevolent purpose. Multiple times we heard the scratch of something against the wooden walls. Once, something large pressed itself against a window, and though it was too dark to see anything distinct, the glass bent inward under pressure before releasing. It was sometime around 2 in the morning, when Brian could no longer tolerate the waiting. He had been pacing for hours, his patience completely exhausted, his sanity worn thin by the combination of fear and helplessness. He grabbed a kitchen knife and moved toward the front door with the declared intention of confronting whatever was outside. Kevin attempted to stop him, but Brian's determination was absolute. He unbarred the door and stepped out into the darkness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a sound emerged from the forest that was not quite a scream and not quite a roar, something that existed somewhere beyond the normal range of animal vocalization. Michelle rushed to the door and closed it, but Brian was already beyond saving. We heard the sound of his movement through the clearing, the desperate nature of his flight toward what he believed might be safety. Then the sound stopped abruptly, cut off as though a switch had been flipped. After that, Brian simply did not exist anymore. He had been part of our group, and then he was not. His absence created a space that we all felt acutely, as though his departure had somehow weakened the cabin itself. Marshall's prediction had proven itself correct. The thing had chosen. The remaining 6 hours until dawn passed with the quality of deepest nightmare. We did not sleep. We scarcely moved. We existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the thing outside to make another decision, to select another member of our group for whatever purpose it intended. The sounds outside gradually diminished as true midnight approached. The circling pattern stopped. The pressing against the cabin ceased. But the absence of activity was somehow more terrifying than the presence of it, because it suggested that the hunting was over, at least for this night. It suggested that the thing had found satisfaction in Brian's selection and was content to wait until the next cycle of hunger returned. As the sky began its gradual transition from absolute black to the deep blue of pre-dawn, we found ourselves able to speak, to break the silence that had held us captive through the long hours. It was Melissa who asked the question that seemed most necessary. What happens now? Does it come back? Does it hunt the rest of us until only one of us remains? Marshall appeared to consider this question with genuine interest. The pattern is complex. It will return, yes, but not immediately. The exchange is satisfied for the moment. A debt has been paid. The thing will rest, will digest, will prepare for the next cycle. But the agreement that binds it here requires additional payments, additional sacrifices. How many? Angela Young asked quietly. How many more? That depends on how much is owed, Marshall replied. Eric made a bargain for his daughter's life, but a life for a life was only the beginning. There are interest payments, you see. There are costs to drawing on power that was never meant to be accessed by humans. I anticipate at least one more before we leave this place, perhaps 2, depending on how the thing interprets the nature of the debt. Kevin stood abruptly, his control finally breaking. You are a monster. You brought us here knowing this, knowing what would happen. I brought you here because the bargain required it, Marshall said, his voice carrying no defensiveness, no attempt at justification. I brought you here because Eric desperately wanted his daughter to live. I brought you here because when people are presented with choices between terrible outcomes, they often choose the terrible thing they can live with over the uncertain outcomes they cannot control. No one forced you to come. You all chose to be here. You could have refused, but none of you did. My husband forced me, Angela said flatly, out of a sense of duty to keep up appearances, to participate in a family trip, because canceling would have raised questions he was not prepared to answer. Kevin had no response to this. They both understood the truth of it. As dawn broke properly, revealing the surrounding forest in shades of gray and green, we ventured out carefully to examine the clearing. We found Brian's belongings scattered across the ground, his shoes, his jacket, fragments of his clothing torn and scattered as though in a frenzied dismemberment. But no body, No remains that could be called physical evidence, just the absence of Brian, and the knowledge that he had been consumed by something that was still present, still conscious, still watching us from the forest. We buried what we could find. It was a strange gesture, honoring a death that seemed to exist outside normal categories of acceptable tragedy. As we placed his shoes and jacket in a shallow grave beneath the trees at the clearing's edge, I became acutely aware that we were participating in a ritual that the thing in the forest understood completely, that satisfied it in some fundamental way. Christina could no longer function with any degree of normalcy. She spent the day moving between rooms, her body present but her mind clearly elsewhere, processing scenarios that offered no acceptable conclusion. Melissa attempted to maintain practical functionality. She inventoried the cabin's food supplies, checked the water system, performed domestic actions that maintained a semblance of normalcy and control. Michelle sat at the table with maps spread out before her, studying the preserve with an intensity that suggested she believed the answer to our situation could be found in the proper reading of terrain. She was processing this situation the only way she knew how, through analysis and logical problem-solving. But logic did not apply here. Maps could not show you where an ancient creature chose to hunt. Eric remained largely isolated, spending long hours on the porch, staring out at the forest. He had gotten what he came for, or so I assumed. His daughter would live because of the bargain he had made. The cost of that life was being paid by people who had no knowledge that they were participating in an exchange that predated modern human morality. It was in the early evening of that second full day, as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, when Marshall gathered us together again. "One of you should leave," he said simply. "The agreement allows for survivors. Not all of you must remain. One could escape now, could return to the world outside, could attempt to resume normal life, but only one." "What is the catch?" Kevin asked immediately. "Why would you offer this unless there is a cost?" "The cost is that you must select which one of you leaves," Marshall said. "The thing in the forest understands hierarchy. It understands power dynamics, social bonds, preference structures. If you cannot agree on who leaves, it will take the decision from you, and the second sacrifice will be followed by a third." We knew what he was suggesting, though none of us wished to acknowledge it directly. He was offering us an escape that required us to select which member of our group would be abandoned to face whatever remained. Michelle refused to participate in this decision. She stood and left the cabin, walking out into the clearing with no apparent concern for danger. We watched as she walked to the far edge of the clearing, where the trees began. She stood there for a long time, facing the forest, and then she turned and came back. "I will not decide who among us is expendable," she said when she re-entered the cabin. "I will not perform that calculus. I do not care if it condemns all of us. I will not reduce any of these people to a cost-benefit assessment." But the rest of us were not so principled. The conversation that followed was one of the most terrible I have ever participated in, a discussion where we were forced to examine our bonds with each other through the lens of survival. Who was most vulnerable? Who had the least to lose in the world outside? Who was already on the border of uselessness? Angela Young herself settled the matter. She was old, she said. She had already lived most of a full life. She had grandchildren, but she was not their primary caregiver. Her husband was gone. She had few strong social bonds remaining. Her departure would create less disruption in the world than the departure of any of the rest of us. The logic was sound. The logic was also monstrous. We allowed Angela to leave the next morning. We provided her with supplies, with information about which direction would lead most directly to the road, with what we believed was reasonable assistance to ensure her safe exit from the preserve. But I do not believe she ever reached that road. I do not believe she ever escaped the forest or rejoined the world outside. Marshall walked with her to the edge of the clearing, and though I could not hear what passed between them, I watched his face, and I saw what appeared to be a transaction of some kind, an agreement being struck. She disappeared into the forest with a dignity that I will remember for the rest of my life. She did not run. She did not cry. She walked into the darkness, as though she was keeping an appointment that had been scheduled long before this preserve existed. The thing took her in the early hours of the morning, when the forest was still wrapped in darkness. But this time we heard something different. We heard vocalization, something that might have been communication, a dialogue between her and the creature. And then the sound stopped. By midday, our group had disintegrated into something barely recognizable. Michelle sat in silence, her belief in nature and healing completely annihilated. Kevin moved through the cabin like a ghost, unable to accept what he had enabled through his participation in this trip. Christina had stopped speaking entirely. Melissa's practical organization had given way to a kind of mechanical function where she performed necessary tasks but seemed to have lost all internal volition. Eric remained remarkably composed, as though his conscience had been settled by the sacrifices he had witnessed. And Marshall waited, patient and calm, as though the unfolding of events was precisely what he had expected and desired. It was Marshall who made the final offer. "One of us could still leave," he said. The thing had been fed. The debt had been partially satisfied. The power that it had lent to Eric's daughter's recovery was beginning to reach its full manifestation. But the agreement was not yet complete. One more exchange was needed, one final payment. This time, we all understood what that meant. One more of us would be chosen or would volunteer, and one of us would be allowed to depart with the knowledge of what we had participated in, with the burden of that knowledge carried forward into whatever remained of our lives. I cannot bring myself to detail how we decided who would be selected. I cannot describe the nature of that conversation, because to do so would be to relive something that my mind keeps trying to reject as impossible. But Kevin ultimately volunteered. He could not live with what he had done, with the chains that bound him to what Eric had set in motion. He could not tolerate being in the same space as his wife, could not face the unspoken accusation in her eyes every waking moment. He left the cabin on a morning when fog hung so thick in the clearing that he disappeared into it after just a few steps. We did not attempt to track his departure. We did not attempt to follow. We sat in the cabin and waited for the sounds that would indicate that he had been taken. When those sounds came, I wept. I wept for Kevin. I wept for Brian. I wept for Angela. I wept for the simple human fact that we had participated, however reluctantly, in a system of sacrifice that demanded a price in human life. The thing in the forest did not bother us again after that. The hunting had ended. The exchange was satisfied. Marshall departed the next morning, returning to whatever existence he maintained outside of places like this. He offered no final words, no attempt at justification or explanation. He simply left, and his departure felt like the removal of some curse or spell. We remained in the cabin for 3 more days, unable to move, unable to process what had happened. Then we returned to the world. We returned to our normal lives. We returned to the impossible task of maintaining silence about what we had witnessed. Michelle eventually sought help from professionals who could offer her neither explanation nor relief. She was treated for depression and anxiety, for trauma that the doctors could not place within any acceptable category because it existed outside the boundaries of what was supposed to be possible. Christina never returned to wildlife management. She works now in an urban office, processing administrative tasks in a carefully controlled environment. She has not left the city limits since we departed that preserve. Melissa lives in a state of careful performance, maintaining a facade of normalcy so complete that she has convinced most people that she is fine. But I have spoken to her, and I know the truth of her internal existence. And Michelle still believes that there is healing available from nature, but the nature she speaks of now is a different thing entirely, a force that is profoundly indifferent to human suffering and entirely capable of extracting terrible prices for simple survival. I remained at the preserve, you see. I asked to stay behind with Marshall. I told the others to go, to return to their normal lives. I told them that I would find my own way out, that I needed time to process what had happened, but I never left. I have been here for 7 years now, living in the cabin, working as the preserve's unofficial ranger and caretaker. I watch the forest. I track the patterns of animal movement, the locations where things occasionally disappear without explanation. I maintain a record of the things I see, though I trust no one with that record. I have become, in many ways, what David Corbett was before me, a person who has seen too much to ever quite return to the world that most people inhabit. And I am writing this account not because I expect anyone to believe it, but because I believe that some knowledge should exist somewhere, should be recorded and preserved, in case there are others like Marshall, others who venture into wild places seeking to draw on powers that should remain undisturbed, others who are willing to sacrifice members of human groups in exchange for supernatural gratification. I have learned that the thing in the forest is intelligent. It is patient. It is selective in who it permits to see it and who it consumes. And it feeds on more than flesh. It feeds on the guilt and silence of people who know what happened, but cannot bring themselves to speak it. The preserve is safe now, by whatever definition of safety applies to a place where an ancient hunger dwells. But safety is not the same as innocence. The preserve will never be innocent again. And neither will any of us who witnessed what occurred in those long nights when 7 of us became 6, then 5, then 4. This is the story. This is what I am leaving behind. Not because I expect it to change anything, but because some truths refuse to remain silent forever, and I am no longer willing to carry this one alone.